thank you everyone for taking the time to work with us today. Really excited to do this survey this year for the IT OT SANS survey. Some really interesting stuff in here. We've got a lot to talk about. I got a lot to pack in, so hopefully we're going to get through it. And I want to get to some time for your questions. But just a quick by way of introduction, if you don't know me, my name's Mark Bristow. I am a SANS certified instructor for the ICS 515 incident response course. Been working with SANS for quite a few years now. SANS is my second job. My day job is I run the branch chief for cyber defense coordination at the Department of Homeland Security's CISA's threat hunting. And my lawyers require me to tell you that I'm here representing myself. I'm not here as a representative of the government, so don't confuse that. But I've been working industrial control systems incidents for more than a decade now. Was previously the branch chief in charge of incident response at ICS CERT, and so I've worked quite a few cases you've heard about in the news and a whole bunch you haven't. And I think that preface and some insight that I have from kind of my career was really interesting in some of the feedback coming in from this particular survey. So we've got some really interesting things that I want to get to. Before I do that, though, today is not the end. We're going to have a panel on the survey coming up in next week. I think it's next Tuesday. So if we don't get the whole conversation done today, we're going to continue it next week. So please do register for that as well. So we're going to start out with the bottom line up front, give a couple of key takeaways on the survey. I'm going to get into a little bit of the demographics, who responded to the survey, talk about some of the business drivers and areas of investment that different organizations are investing in and how effective those are, talk about risks. Then we're going to talk about something near and dear to my heart, which is the incident response and some case studies, some really interesting data there. Talk about some of how our defensive posture has changed over time. We're going to do a lot of looking back at like the 2017 and the 2019 SANS surveys, because some of the questions are the same, and we see how things have trended over the years. There's some really interesting takeaways from that analysis. Then we're going to talk about the cloud, which was an interesting takeaway from this whole thing. Then how we're managing vulnerability, some really exciting progress there. And then finally, we'll close out with some parting viewpoints and then get into your questions. So as you might expect, ransomware was on the mind of everyone. The survey for the actual results was open during the time when the Colonial Pipeline ransomware incident, as well as the JBS ransomware incident, took place. And so I think a lot of different people kind of had that on the mind when answering the survey, and that teases out, as it was the #1 overall concern of risk by respondents by quite some margin. Although nation-state actors, which had a tendency to kind of be the #1, did come in #2 with 43.1% of respondents looking at as their #1 concern. So, ransomware and criminal actors definitely taking some dominance that they didn't have before. But I think that's to be expected with all of the ransomware surge that's happening across the entire planet. We had more incidents reported, more organizations actually said that they had an incident in the last 12 months. I think really shocking to me anyway was that 90% of those that had an incident reported at least one of their incidents had an actual process control system impact. So this is a little different than we've seen in previous incidents case studies, because we see that while there are a lot of incidents, they're not actually having impact to operations, which is not the case in this survey. And we'll dig a little bit deeper into that. One of the things that was really troubling that came out of the survey was, even with that statistic, 48% of respondents could not say with confidence whether or not they actually had an incident in the last 12 months. So if you kind of take out the people that said that they are not allowed to respond due to company policy, and you look at the people that responded and saying, hey, we don't have sufficient telemetry to assess, or we don't think we had an incident, 48% of respondents fall into the category of they're not sure. So that was a really interesting takeaway for me, because we have incidents kind of being more severe than they have been previously, and then we have a whole bunch of people that aren't actually sure how many incidents they've had, right? So very kind of interesting dichotomy there. We'll unpack that a little bit more. Another big takeaway from the incident data was the targeting of engineering workstations. almost 20% of respondents said that their engineering workstations were involved in any incident that they had. This is really concerning because those engineering workstations are incredibly critical terrain for an adversary to build that predictable, repeatable effect. And that level of targeting is definitely a concerning takeaway and something that's really different than we did before. We did see a lot, though, of kind of process maturity when it comes to incidents. Despite the unsurety of detection, a lot of different organizations are using threat hunting methodologies and some good foundational detection capability to look for threats in their environment. So that was definitely a promising takeaway, but kind of some mixed results there. We've also seen a lot of interesting change in the industry, right? Continue to see growth in budgets, and we're now seeing what I like to refer to as the professionalization of the control system cybersecurity workforce. We're seeing a lot more people with certifications or dedicated ICS cybersecurity roles than we have over time. So that's like a really, really promising sign as we get more of those kind of well-qualified cyber defenders out there. We'll talk a little bit more about that. We did see, 47% of respondents had their budgets increase over the last year. 32% said they stayed the same, and only 16% had a decrease in their budget. So overall, significant growth in cybersecurity budgets for control systems, going on out there. We also saw an uptick in the use of MITRE ATT&CK. So 47% of respondents were using MITRE ATT&CK in their industrial control system cybersecurity program, which is awesome. Big supporter of ATT&CK for the enterprise, but also for ATT&CK for ICS. They've already updated a few times. The team at MITRE is doing a really great job with that, and really excited to see that adoption, because I think that common lexicon and kind of way of describing things is something that was really missing in our industry. And I'm glad to see that now that we have something, it's being actually used and adopted, right? It's very, very encouraging for me. Kind of an interesting change, though, that really shocked me, to be completely honest with you, was cloud adoption. Yeah, I know everyone is focused on moving to the cloud for their business, their enterprise, and heard some rumblings about some of the cloud offerings for control systems. But 49% of respondents are using cloud technologies for operational outcomes. So while lots of people are using cloud for stuff, they're actually using it to directly support the process control system, which to me was just, I was not expecting that number. I knew there's going to be more cloud adoption, but 49% using it for operational outcomes is a lot. It is a lot. We also see the threat intel space for control systems. Half of them are using ICS specific threat intelligence, which, a couple of years ago was a very nascent industry. We're now seeing that really mature. I think one of the most surprising positive things I heard that was in this survey, 16% of organizations are doing continual patching on their control systems. That is amazing. A couple of years ago, if you just patching at all was like, no, we can't do that. It's going to break the system, right? People are doing it, continuous patching programs. That is awesome. And it really is a great testament to the maturity of our industry, and that we're able to actually do things like patch without bringing downtime to the process consistently. Super awesome development there. We also see 42% of respondents were using active scanning technologies for vulnerability assessment. Another thing that kind of traditionally in this space has been like, oh yeah, well, we can't run Nmap, it's going to crash everything, right? Well, people are using it. The product community has really, and I talked about this in my asset identification webcast, the vendors have really come up with some new technologies and capabilities that really work, and our process control systems have gotten a little bit more mature. So active scanning is not only a thing you can do, many are doing it and doing so successfully. So that's really awesome. The one thing that was, though, a gap as I bring up scanning and asset inventory, only 58% of organizations had a formal asset inventory program. So if you've ever run into me at a con, back when the world was open or something like that, you'll know that this is something I'm very passionate about, because I don't, you can't build cybersecurity of anything if you don't actually understand in a deep way what's supposed to be on the environment, how you're supposed to detect anomalies if you don't know what normal looks like, right? And asset inventory is critical to a critical underpinning of that activity. And with only having 58% of people doing that in some type of formalized, structured way, Clearly, we still have a place to go. This is something I was hoping would be in like the 90s, and was not. So still a majority. So we'll look at the bright side, but at the end of the day, still not enough, right? This is a more fundamental thing that really everyone needs to be doing. So those were some of the big takeaways. Let me just kind of dive right into the content. And again, sorry, there is so much to unpack in this paper that I'm not going to be able to get to it all. Hopefully, we'll get some good questions. But I think important to start out with is demographics, right? Like who responded to this survey. And I will say, compared to other years, the survey was more evenly distributed. So the energy sector came in with 17% of the overall respondents. But if you look at the energy over time, I think 2 surveys ago, or the 19th survey, they had like 35 or so percent. So the percentages really kind of shrunk down, and we got a much more diverse kind of perspective and portfolio of industry verticals responding to the survey. We even had some people from the gaming industry, which is not something you typically think of as industrial control systems. But I'll tell you, my cousin-in-law builds games for the gaming industry, and they absolutely have control systems, really interesting ones that can pay you. But we even had people from gaming, right? So it wasn't just your kind of standard stuff with energy. We had some people from aviation industry, from space systems, cool. So we'll really go a wide variety of asset owner operators responding to the survey. So got that kind of diverse portfolio. What was really encouraging to me was that at least half of the people who responded to the survey indicated that ICS cybersecurity was their primary duty. So in the past, we've had a lot of people who do 10 or 15% of their time, maybe 20% of their time is ICS security, and then they have some other either engineering or process control role, or they work in IT. We're seeing a lot more of those dedicated roles, right? And this is just, I think, a reflection of the investment in ICS cybersecurity that's going on in our businesses and the importance of this. And I think as much as things like the Colonial Pipeline incident, I think brought ransomware to the forefront, it brought it to the boardroom. And I think we're going to see continued growth from some of these types of incidents that will help us in those cases about why this is critically important to business continuity, and why having a good cybersecurity program in your ICS is really important. We also had a number of kind of engineering support people that were responded. Food and ag was 4%. So we had a lot of really, like I said, interesting dichotomy of organizations. Also, a lot of small businesses, right? Up to 1,000 was our definition of small. So we had a lot of organizations that from kind of smaller entities replying, which is really good because I think that's an underrepresented community when it comes to control systems. So I was really encouraged to see that. And then we also had representation from all over the world, and some things that didn't quite make the paper but were kind of interesting were like slicing and dicing some of the respondents based on their geographical region. So some really kind of interesting insights about what was happening there. But by and large, similar problems, similar challenge sets. But was definitely some interesting, and glad to see that representation, including Africa. Love it. So I mentioned at the top, one thing I'm really personally, and as a SANS instructor, this is obviously a passion of mine. I love teaching. I love educating others and bringing people up. I tell people I'm trying to build an army of ICS cyber professionals. Really, so the inside track on that is so I want to retire someday, and so I need other people to go and do this job and do it well. In the 2019 survey, only 38% of respondents had certifications. But in this survey, it was like 47 or 48%, right? So we're making some significant strides in, it was 54%. We're making some significant strides in kind of professionalizing the workforce, right? Because I think one of the challenges people have, I don't want to start a flame war about some of the certifications out there, but some don't necessarily meet the mark. Right, but and I think SANS actually had a big role in helping to promote this, the certifications across the community, and you can see that from the results. A lot of people that responded have a SANS certification, but really that professionalization. So when you're trying to hire talent, you have some expectation that they have at least a minimum bar of what they're doing. right? And that was something that didn't exist before, but does now. And I think it's really just great about the maturity of our community. Again, people are either investing in themselves, their companies are investing in them. It's just a really great sign as we move forward. Sorry. So let's talk about that, right? Because at the end of the day, and this is something that really frustrates me, and I just did a CISA webinar about building an incident response team. And, a lot of people don't think, they think about incident response, they think about ICS cybersecurity as something that kind of sits on an island. And you need to remember that like business outcomes is like what we're going for here. It's not all about like just doing security for security's sake, right? So, what are the business drivers that are driving that investment, right? This was actually kind of really interesting to me because, I expected that, safety, such a safety culture in this community would be number one, is kind of like the hands down. When we put it in the survey, it was almost like, oh, this is a throwaway. Everyone's going to say safety. Nope. Ensuring the reliability and availability control systems was the number one overall response. But some other things kind of interesting happened in the details. The risk of financial loss dropped a number of spots, which I thought was interesting by comparison of ransomware being the number one thing on everyone's mind, and then like we're not concerned about financial loss as a business driver. A little bit of a disconnect there. Why could that be? Why is safety not as prioritized? Because again, safe, reliable operations for people on and off site went down. Maybe that's because there's not that many people there anymore, right? I mean, with the pandemic staffing, perhaps that got deprioritized or budgets got slimmed down. Not really sure what that's all about, but I was really expecting safety to kind of come up as the number one, and it was not. On the budget front, like I said, some of the huge budgets kind of went down a little bit, so they're greater than $10 million USD. But remember, most of our respondents fall into that small category. Most organizations were seeing an increase in their budgets, and only 16% overall had a negative change to their budget. So at the end of the day, we're seeing most organizations, again, that increased investment, because I think organizations writ large and the boardroom is starting to understand how ICS cybersecurity can drive the outcomes they're looking for their shareholders. Also interesting was, paying back to the shareholders also went down in the survey for the business drivers. So just something. Sometimes the data just brings you places you're like, okay, sure, that's what people are doing. I'll, love it. Like, let's just move, go for it. So let's talk about risk, right? And this is really an important one. This one is about perceived risk. So not where are you seeing the most attacks or whatever, but where do you perceive risk? And what are you most concerned about? And we're going to do some analysis about how this actually touches with threat vectors here in a minute, but I want to tee this up about risk, right? So obviously, ransomware, financially motivated crimes, number one, right? I think that's kind of super obvious as to why that was the results in this survey. Again, with some really high-profile ransomware attacks happening, and quite frankly, just generally ransomware attacks happening a lot more often than people are admitting to. I think is drove that one to the top. The nation state adversaries still hanging in there though, with the 43% of respondents considering that one of their top three risks, right? A kind of interesting aggregate data point here is if you add them all up, what I refer to as non-intentional threat vectors went way up this year. What I mean by non-intentional threat vectors, so a ransomware actor is doing it on purpose. A nation state actor is doing it on purpose. Latent risk from an infection and a partner company isn't targeting you. That's not really on purpose. Accidental insider, non-witting insiders, so people who just make accidents, do accidents in your environment, went up. So when you kind of add the IT-OT integration, devices that can't secure themselves, a significant amount of the perceived risk here is coming from non-threat actors, but other kind of aggregated latent risk in our systems. So this is really interesting because we spend a lot of time and effort focusing on threat hunting for bad guys and all that kind of stuff. And I think it just goes to show that some of the areas of where we need to make some more progress are some of those fundamental things like asset inventories and vulnerability management, and that risk and those trust relationships we have with partners is bringing in more risk than I think that we're really accounting for when we reconstruct where investments are. And we'll talk in a couple of slides about not only where the risks actually came from, but then also where we're putting our money and against which things that compensates. And there's a little bit of a disconnect there, which I thought was pretty interesting. So the next one, this was my favorite question. So in this question, we asked, based on your understanding of the ICS threat landscape, which 3 sectors are most likely to have a successful ICS compromise with impact to the safe, reliable operational process? So not who's the most likely to have an incident, right? But who is most likely to have an ICS impact from an incident? Like, where is the next big one going to happen, right? Where's the next one going to be? And I thought this was really, really interesting. So again, energy was the #1 response here. But if you shift down to the data and look and parse this out, and I break this out a little bit more in the paper, but if you look at what sectors were represented and what choices they made, and all the data is anonymous, right? So we don't have like by name, but you identify what sector you work in, and then you identify this question. Most organizations did not choose their own sector as the biggest at risk. So when we kind of compare that to 48% of respondents couldn't be sure they didn't have an incident, so we're not really having a lot of good visibility, but my industry is totally fine. That doesn't really jive, right? There were only 4 that picked their own industry. So defense industrial base, communications, energy, and water, wastewater picked themselves. But everybody else picked somebody else as the most likely to have that process control impact. And I thought that was a really interesting, I don't know where that inconsistency comes from. I mean, I know that like when I am operating a system, I know where all the bodies are buried. And so I maybe have a little bit of jaded dread about how those types of systems are secured. But I guess I'm unique in that perspective, and that most of the respondents, thought that the grass was browner on the other side. So really kind of interesting. The other thing that I thought was interesting was so of people not selecting their own sector, energy and healthcare, public health were the #1 and #2 choices, which makes some sense. Healthcare, again, going back to ransomware, getting ravaged by ransomware. It's a huge scourge in that industry. Big problems there. There's a lot of good people working on that, but it is consistently having challenges. So I thought it was interesting, but I thought it was interesting that like the defense industrial base was so low. The DIB is a favorite target again of the #2 threat actor in nation states, and people are thinking they're not having a big potential impact there. So some really interesting nuance in some of the responses to the survey. And like I said, I was really excited about this question, and it totally worked out very differently than I thought it would. So that's about doing surveys, people. You got to go where the data takes you. So let's talk about incidents. Clearly something near and dear to my heart. So that was we just talked about perceived risk. That's what people thought was going to happen, who was most likely to have it, what the threat vectors are going to be. Let's talk about what people actually saw. Now, the sample population of the who had an incident was smaller than the other population. Remember, 48% of respondents couldn't be sure whether or not they actually had an incident or not. So, yeah. The first thing we asked was, threat actor risk over time, right? So who was the threat actor that was most prevalent in the incidents that you had? And I'll preface this with, attribution is only as strong as the attributor, right? And so I think that is one of the reasons why hackers, once again, continues to be #1, because, hackers is just some type of big kind of nebulous bucket of threat actors. But I wanted the data to be consistent to the previous results, and so we had it in the previous 2 surveys, so I wanted to keep it in here. But still the kind of #1 problem. As you would imagine, organized crime jumped 5 spots from the 2019 survey, but again, very consistent with ransomware and criminal actors being the kind of #1 concern. Foreign nation states were the #2 threat vector when asked that question, but from an incident attribution perspective, again, kind of taking the fact that some of them might be captured in hackers, went down to #7. which I thought was interesting that they were so highly ranked with perceived risk, but not with actualized risk. The risk from competitors also dropped 3 spots, which I thought was kind of interesting. I guess industrial espionage is not fun anymore or something, but interesting. And another one that I thought was really, really interesting was that domestic intelligence services went up 3. I'm not really sure how to deal with this particular question, because I'm like, people are worried that their own domestic intelligence services are hacking into their control systems. Like, I want to talk about that, maybe over a beverage or something, because that's a very interesting concern that people have. And of course, it's all anonymized. If you did that, please follow up with me. I'd love to know why you're concerned about that. Like, I really am super curious about what's going on with that, but I don't have the names of who said what. So that was a really interesting one. Then, of course, we asked about, have you experienced a security incident? And in this security incident, we can figure out that at least 15% of people don't lie. They said yes. I think the answer is probably closer to 100%. But again, this is where your ability to detect comes into play. We've had suspicions but lack proof. They're probably not lying as well. We don't know when we have no suspicions. I'm surprised at the number of answers that came out of that, because we don't know and we can't be sure about it is not a very comfortable answer. Insufficient telemetry, again, that's another one where it's like, yep, okay, we recognize we have a problem. But again, 48%, when you kind of add up all the numbers, aren't really sure if they've had an incident. And that's concerning to me, right? We have some work to do in the detection and anomaly detection space in order to kind of close that particular gap. This was another thing that really, quite frankly, surprised me. And that's the percent of incidents that are disruptive. So you typically think of incidents in the control systems context. A lot of times they end up, an adversary or a piece of malware or whatever gets into the control system environment, but doesn't have any impact. And so we really wanted to ask, like, how disruptive have these incidents actually been to the process? Because at the end of the day, that's what we're defending, right? Is we're defending the process, right? The adversary getting into our environment doesn't mean that they've won. They only win when they disrupt your process or achieve their goals, right? So looking at the number of incidents, again, most respondents had less than 10 incidents, so at least one incident, right? These are the people that said yes to we've had an incident, or said we think we've had an incident. Interesting enough, there were a number of respondents in the 500 to 1,000 incidents category. That's a lot. I'm hoping that was just a statistical outlier in the results. I was expecting more in the 50 or so incidents a year at any given organization. That's about how we saw. But and maybe we just have a mismatch on what we mean by incident versus like a security event. That's what happens when you do surveys. That's the best data you can get. But what was really interesting to me was the next question, which was how many of them were disruptive? You don't hear a lot about people who have cybersecurity incidents outside of ransomware that are impacting their ability to operate their process control systems and their process. And yet, a little over 90% had some level of disruption come from their incidents, which I thought was really, really interesting, in that there was this kind of huge dichotomy of disruptive incidents, and then kind of in the public narrative anyway, not a lot of reports about incidents. Just continues the trend that incident reporting, there's still a little bit of mystification around control system cyber incidents that, is something we need to work on as a community. But if we're having this much disrupted from this problem, like I said, it really surprised me that we had this many disruptions. This problem is getting worse, or we're just getting more honest about it. Not sure which one it is, but that's really interesting takeaways, that we're actually having process impact from so many of our incidents. So how are we doing? This was an interesting way to take a look kind of over time on that compromise to detection. When you look at the overall statistics on how long it takes to actually detect, contain, remediate, we expect that the containment would be, reasonably short in time and eradication, because we oftentimes have to wait to schedule downtime or something like that. We expect those time frames to be a little bit longer, and that's borne out in the data, is that it took longer to remediate. But the detection to compromise the detection time, really, if you look at how that's going over time, I think really doing making a lot of progress on this front. I think back to working the Black Energy and Havix cases from the 2014 timeframe, and the dwell time of the adversary in those two cases were like 3 years in some cases. It seemed to be like a magic number of ICS incidents where they were in there for like 3 years before anyone noticed. And we're really dropping that down. Like very few from the compromise to detection, right? We had 0 in the greater than 1 year. We didn't have anyone in the 7 to 12 months range. So there was a lot of good progress going on in how fast we're detecting. I think that is a direct benefit from the investments that the community has been doing over the last few years in detection technologies and monitoring. So that's really awesome that we're like making some progress, and you can see that coming down on that initial compromise to detection dwell time. But the other kind of caveat that I really have to say on all these numbers is, the denominator of all this data is not known. It's the best data we have, but we don't actually fully understand. Again, going back to almost half the organizations could not actually say with confidence they didn't have an incident. They didn't get to answer these questions because they didn't have an incident, but the denominator isn't really clear, right? So perhaps this is just data bias, and we actually do have some long dwell time incidents happening right now. But over time, again, looking at the slide on the chart on the right, we're seeing a lot of progress in our ability to detect these things faster, and that's really great, right? But we do need to still work on trying to get that containment and eradication timeframes down. But in process control, we've got a little bit different constraints than like our IT friends. So that brings us on to initial access vectors, and this is where I kind of wanted to juxtapose the initial access vectors versus where people thought the risk was. So most organizations, their initial access vector was remote access services. And this is not surprising, but it's disheartening. It's 2021. Why do I still need a category for public-facing applications and internet accessible devices? And why are they the second and third ranking answer on this survey? Same thing with remote access. In the 2019 survey, it was 41%. It's 36.7, so 37%. It went down, but that's not really a lot. That's not really the progress that we need, right? Understand, especially given the pandemic, I know a lot of operators who would never let any process control action happen outside the control room, and trying to keep the number of humans down due to the pandemic, et cetera. A lot of remote access pathways opened up that were not even considered previously. So I'm not super surprised about the remote access one, but really we have a lot of things that are still some of the same challenges that we've been dealing with for decades. I know at ICS Cert, I think we did our first internet accessible control systems devices paper in like 2011. So it's like 10 years on, and we're still having this as a big problem. Something we need to start looking at for some better solutions, because what we're doing now is clearly not working. Just challenge. Spear phishing attachment, still high up there. I still don't get this. You shouldn't have email in your process control system, but cool. Y'all do you. Removable media makes a lot of sense, right? What I thought was really interesting, though, was the number of engineering workstation compromises. So 18.4% of respondents had listed their engineering workstation as an initial infection vector of a compromise. This is one of the most concerning things that I saw in this entire survey, because your engineering workstation is such a critical asset for an adversary. When you're talking about like cyber key terrain, it's such a critical asset for an adversary if they want to build that predictable, repeatable effect, right? They're trying to build cyber weapons, not just run ransomware or smash around on your HMI, but actually build something designed to disrupt or destroy your control system. They have to go to the engineering workstation. Okay, every process control system is a little different. Maybe they don't have to in your particular case, but like generally speaking, this is a piece of data. It has all the configurations. It's got all your screens. It's got all your logic, right? They're going to need that data. And I was shocked because if they want to deploy, kind of going back to the ICS cyber kill chain that CISA put out, right? There's the stage one where it's really kind of a reconnaissance intelligence activity. And then phase two is when you have the actual like effect, right? Well, a lot of those effects, same thing if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK model, need to get delivered through a critical asset like the engineering workstation that has access to push programming down to even well-architected environments, change the logic on your controllers. So I'm really troubled that there was this much penetration down to that level. It was this pervasive. Yeah, really troubled. This is the asset where you can go, from engineering workstation to consequence in 2 seconds, right? It's very, very concerning. The other thing I thought was kind of interesting was wireless compromise, and we'll get to that in a second as why that was interesting. But the engineering workstation one, even though it's not like the #1 vector, it's never going to be. I was surprised. 20% was a little shocking to me. So are we doing the right things? This was another kind of interesting. We asked this in 2 different questions. So we looked at the perceived risk and perceived impact to different industrial control systems components to see like what, if they're tracking, right? Because you would imagine that things that are perceived as the highest risk would also be perceived as the highest impact to the process. And that was true for most of this, right? That logic tracked. But there were some like kind of key gaps that I thought were really interesting. So, engineering assets, obviously the number one concern on both risk and impact. But when you compare that back to them being the number 6 most common initial infection vector, if they are so risky and so impactful, why are they still getting compromised as much, right? So this is some interesting questions that we should be asking ourselves about, are we investing in the right stuff? One that I thought was really interesting was mobile devices. So it came out as the number 6 risk, mobile devices, but then what the impact was like, yeah, but actually no impact to the process. So why was that, right? That's a really kind of interesting dichotomy in like thinking there's a lot of risk here, but at the end of the day, it can't actually impact things. Like a little bit of a disconnect. Field communications, right? Field communications were a high impact, but a low risk. So if you're worried about somebody getting into your control system environment, I would imagine field communications would be pretty important. And they're identified as important, but not risky. Is this overconfidence in the isolation of our field communications? I'll tell you that's misplaced in a lot of incidents I've seen, but just kind of interesting. Same thing for controllers. They were the 11th ranked risk, but the number 4 ranked for impact. I mean, I think the impact is pretty obvious, but if they're so important to the safe, reliable operation of the process, why are they not something that we're looking at from a more risk perspective? Again, really thought that. The other one that I guess didn't surprise me, but was interesting to me was non-routable and wireless access. Everyone thinks non-routable and wireless access risk and impact was like down to low, right? Well, hold that thought for a little bit, but if you want non-attributable, not reputable effects operations, going after wireless comms is a pretty solid idea. Not gonna lie, it's called standoff distance, people. You can do wireless from pretty far away. But apparently not a concern that most are really focused on. So where are we spending our money? That's another really important question. And I think, once again, interesting to see how this has changed over time, right? So we're seeing a lot of movements to technologies or investments that ultimately support threat hunting and threat hunting methodologies, right? So allow listing, behavioral analysis tools. Again, the number of respondents not on this chart, but using threat hunting methodologies went up to 35%, which is really great. Some of those telemetry investments are really paying off. You actually saw some dips in some investments where we've kind of made them and they're producing value in what we're monitoring and how we're tracking our incidents. We'll get into the next slide, but the dollar investment has actually gone down a little bit, but I think it's because we've gotten that accomplished. Lots of operational technology security operations centers, so the IT SOCs are out there. The number of people that have them went up by 14%. People planning them went down by 8%, but that makes some sense because they've already got them. So that's good. So again, love the focus on an OT solution. A lot of organizations reporting use of endpoint detection response tools. I thought that was really interesting because the EDR market space for IT is, I'll call it barely matured, and for OT, we have a lot of people saying that they've adopted these technologies. So like y'all got endpoint detection response tools on your process control systems. Awesome if you are, but this does not jive with my experience. Most process control systems that I've come across don't have that, although, I'm an incident responder, so I guess I've got a little bit of selection bias in the people I'm working with. But thought that was really interesting. That market space, is, like I said, barely mature in the IT side. It's getting better, but I don't see a lot of OT specific products out there for that. So maybe I just need to educate myself. But really interesting. If you are using EDR in your control systems environment, once again, I would love to talk to you about that because that was a little surprising for me in the data that was being used so much. Same thing with behavior analysis tools. Like everyone's like, yeah, we're using behavioral analysis tools. Cool. You ever actually tried to use a behavioral analysis tool? They're like a lot of them are challenging. And there are some that are for control systems environments, but the marketplace there is not huge. So I was a little surprised at the amount of organizations say that they had adopted these technologies when, in my view, they're still nascent. So it was really kind of interesting. And then the other thing that this one upset me, frankly, was SOAR. So we have a 28% adoption rate of security automation and response tools. Process control is an automation industry. Like at the end of the day, like that's what we do here, right? Like we use computers to like remove the humans from the loop and like make a widget or generate electric power or clean water, right? Like, but we're not doing that on the security front, right? 28% adoption. There's just like some real irony in the lack of use of SOAR tools, which I thought was an interesting data point. So the other one that was interesting was telemetry, and this directly relates to the asset inventory. And I'm sorry, I'm going to die on this hill. Without adequate asset inventory, you are not going to have a successful security program. You're just not. Still having some challenges there. We have a lot of kind of perceived monitoring coverage. Like, oh yes, I'm monitoring those things. That's great. And when you're asked, like in the last slide, like, are you investing in monitoring? Like you say yes. But this slide really starts to tease out, like, what are you monitoring? And it turns out we're doing a lot of that monitoring of the IT-like equipment in our process control environments, which was, I don't want to say surprising to me. It wasn't surprising, but I guess it was, once again, disheartening because, a good integrated incident response detection threat hunting program is going to correlate data from both their process control system and their IT telemetry and the security stuff and like historian logs and like put them all together. And we're not really seeing a lot of that teased out in the data as far as what is actually being monitored. And again, when the inventory levels kind of also start to slip off as we go lower in the Purdue model. So very kind of concerned about how much telemetry, while we're doing monitoring, and monitoring is important and great, are we monitoring the right things? Is something that was one concern, right? When we look at some of the other data here and kind of interpolate that, and not all of this is on the slide, some of it's in the paper, but 24% don't have a formal threat hunting process. Look at this as a positive. That means 76% do. That's great that we're using some formalized processes. I think MITRE ATT&CK adoption is a critical one there. 17% responded that they're not even looking at threats in their OT environment at all, which again, the flip side of that is 83 are, but I would hope that with all of the kind of what's out there right now, we'd have a little bit more kind of threat hunting adoption in our process control environments. So it's just an interesting data point. This next one I thought was really surprising to me. Only 24% of respondents were correlating historian data with their cybersecurity data. So they're not ingesting that process data. And a great way to do that is use your historian where you already have a lot of your process data aggregated in a system that isn't necessarily core to the actual control system. But they're not correlating that. It's like not forwarding that to Splunk or to Elastic, which was kind of interesting. Also, kind of going back to the no one thinks about wireless, that's kind of borne out here, right? Wireless and non-routable communications continue to be a blind spot in our visibility. And so when you look too at that, like how much of that is actually getting monitored, we're not really doing a lot in that space, which could be an opportunity for somebody to build some products, because a lot of control systems are using some level of wireless communication technology, whether it even be like cellular or whatever. And we'll talk a little bit more about the communications pathways in a couple of slides, but really interesting that's not a big concern, or they're not getting a lot of telemetry from those things. And to kind of quote Rumsfeld, when I look at that monitored and inventoried, we've got some known unknowns. We know that we have inventoried assets that aren't monitored, because if you look, the monitoring goes down in every kind of case. But we also have unknown unknowns, the non-inventoried, non-monitored, especially when we get lower in the Purdue stack. It's really, problematic. Again, asset inventory, super important. Slide, there we go. This is one that shocked me. I was actually really surprised about this particular data point. I expected to see significantly more cloud adoption than before, right? Cloud, all the things, great. There's lots of scalability and there's lots of things, but fundamentally, cloud creates a codependency on your not only the cloud provider, but also your ability to transport data to and from that cloud provider, which, and maybe I just have a legacy mindset. The control systems community usually very concerned about uptime and reducing complexity. I was really surprised to see the amount of people adopting cloud technologies for actual process control. I was expecting things like having the SOC was in the cloud, or using a managed security provider, so that hosted stuff. I was totally expecting all of that, but off-premises cloud-based systems in support of the control system, like actually directly supporting the control system, 20%. That was a lot. 32% using it for kind of the core operations of their control system environment. I just was shocked about this. I understand for like this continuity purposes, for the IT stuff, like I grok this, but I was really shocked to see the level of cloud adoption, which is going to just bring a whole new set of challenges to our control systems. I just saw we launched a beta of 509 cloud incident response. Perhaps the OT responders should start putting that in their training plan if we're going to be using this much cloud. So vulnerabilities, right? This is something we talk about a lot in the community. A lot of vulnerability management. It's something we talk about, patch management, that kind of stuff in our control systems. Again, really excited to see the adoption of vulnerability scanning technologies, right? I thought that was really great. Historically viewed as super risky, but really we're seeing that. We're seeing people use the FAT and SAT testing to 36% using that to mitigate risks before they actually hit their control system. Really excited about that. That's a key differentiator we have in ICS security that they don't have in OT. Doing a lot of anomaly detection based on known good configurations, right? 30% doing that. 16% doing continual patching. I love it. I love it. I'm so excited. You know, that was crazy talk years ago. Scanning was crazy talk a couple years ago, and now we have significant adoption. We got 6% of respondents not doing anything about their patch management. That's okay, right? I guess people are making those determinations, but I'm seeing a lot of progress on the vulnerability management front, and really, really excited about that. So this one is better to read in the paper, but it's an important one to talk about. MITRE ATT&CK. We're seeing, again, a lot of organizations using MITRE ATT&CK. They're doing assessments. 3/4 of respondents have done an assessment in the last year. 30% are doing continual assessment. So that's also really great. Only 10% have never done one, so we're trending in the right direction on those. Most of them are using OT-specific vendors for that, so we're getting the right people to do it. MITRE ATT&CK is really taken off. 47% are using it at some way in their framework. 43% are using that for assessment, 31 for pen testing, 11 for adversary emulation. So awesome there. We also have that what's on there is the kind of coverage assessment. So people using it for assessments, like what was their coverage of the different attack categories against their systems. Really kind of interesting data there. Recommend you pour into it in the actual report. But really glad to see ATT&CK being leveraged to mature those. So we only have a few minutes left. I'm going to try and get into a couple of questions with the remaining time. But before we get into that, just kind of some parting shots. Clearly, ransomware, number one. I think we all understand why. We've been making some really great progress as a community, right? Continued budgets, increases, more qualified personnel, the dedicated roles. People doing much more, 3/4 doing assessments in the last 12 months. Those numbers went up. The 16% continual patch rate, active scanning being used, MITRE ATT&CK being used. I mean, like just some really great progress that we have made in the community since the 2019 survey. So pat yourselves on the back for all that. Been some really great work going on out there. We do still have some areas to improve, right? That threat awareness and in incidents is still a little uneven, where our perceived risk isn't really lining up with our true risk, which isn't necessarily lining up with our investments, right? And that's one of the things that I really wanted to tease out of this survey was like, are we doing the right things? And we are in a lot of instances, but we're not in some. The amount of process control impact on incidents was, again, something that really was interesting to me. The number of people who say they can't tell whether or not they had an incident or not is also very concerning. So we've made a lot of progress, but we do have still some work to do. We've got some foundational work, right? Asset identification work is still lagging where it really needs to be in order to enable some of those more advanced tactics. But we did make a lot of progress over the last year. So, we should all be really happy with what we've done, but definitely still more work for us to do. So really excited about that. So once again, continue the conversation. I'll throw this up in the chat for the panel that's going to happen next Tuesday. And with that, we'll kick it over to Q&A.
All right, thanks for that great presentation, Mark. We have a few questions here, so I'll jump right in. The first one says, what do you mean using cloud for operational outcomes?
Yeah, so if you look at the way that the question was broken out, and I get into more detail on this paper, cramming this all into an hour was a challenge. But we asked like what they were using the cloud technologies for, right? So was it for actual process control, like decision making, like logic, like optimization, or was it for the managed security provider, or was it just for DR? And a lot of them were using them for process relevant outcomes. So like actually for like primary control or control configuration augmentation, right? So it was, that's what we mean by those process outcomes, not using it for like backups, right? You're putting your backups in the cloud, great. That's not really a process outcome, but they're actually using it in that kind of the core logic for the actual control, which is what I thought was really interesting. from that.
All right, thanks. They say active scanning becoming more common in the ICS environment? Question mark.
Looks that way. Again, this was something that I was pleasantly surprised to see. Again, that kind of legacy mindset that active scanning was, it's just not something you can do in control systems, but I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but I think it was like 42% are using it. And since I would imagine if it was crashing the process all the time, they'd stop using it. Yeah, definitely some more use going on that.
All right, thanks. I think this next one is the same question, but will the underlying data set be released, and what about the raw data set?
I don't believe that we released the raw data, but that's more of a SANS policy question that I'll take offline. But I don't think we typically release the raw data, but if there's questions you have further, happy to entertain them.
All right, thanks. Let's see here. This one, I'm not sure if it's quite a question or an answer. It says, know who remembers who answered domestic intelligence services, and they said domestic intelligence services. So I'm not sure if there's a question there, but we'll go on to the next one.
I have a question, and that is, if you did say that you were concerned about domestic intelligence services getting into your control system, I'd love to talk about that. So I've got a question.
All right, thanks. This next one says, in reference to the domestic intelligence services increasing in threat actor risk over time, were most of the respondents to the survey U.S. respondents? If so, could it be due to lack of understanding of laws or proliferation of non-encrypted IoT devices?
That is a great question. I did not actually rip that out by respondent geographic region. I tried to look at it a little bit from a sector perspective and didn't really get any key insight there. So that is something that I can certainly work with the team to pull up and see if there's any insight from that. But I did not look at it in that particular slice. There's lots of ways you can slice data. I didn't happen to do that one. So yeah, if we can take down who that is, and we can get back to you if there's any insight from there.
All right, thanks. We'll squeeze this last one in. How good are diodes for OT security?
Well, it depends. The answer to all good questions is it depends. So a properly configured, well-architected network leveraging data diodes can be really a value add. I have seen data diodes deployed, 2 of them at the same time in each direction. That's just an expensive firewall at this point. So it really depends on how you deploy, what your security model is. I mean, I think I'm a big fan of optical isolation technology. I think that there's a lot of value in data diodes. But again, it's really the devil's in the details about how you deploy and implement them in your system and how they fit in your overall security picture. Generally, they're a value add in my view, but you can definitely do it wrong and have negative impact from them. So make sure you're working with somebody who knows how to deploy them properly.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Mark, for your great presentation. And to Cisco Umbrella, Dragos, Keysight Technologies, Network Perception, Nozomi Networks, and Tenable for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.
Thanks, everybody.